Welcome to Caledonia Sleeps, your peaceful escape into the heart of Scotland. If these stories bring you comfort, a like and a subscribe means the world, and it helps more people find their way to the fireside. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and if you have any connection to the Scottish coast or islands, or if the sea runs in your family in any way, I'd love to hear about it. So settle in, pull the covers a little closer, let the room grow still around you. Outside, the wind is moving across the water, long and low and steady. The sea is a dark pewter colour, shifting slowly beneath a sky that cannot decide between cloud and stars. The tide is pulling back from the shore, uncovering the black rocks and the pale wet sand, and the sound it makes as it retreats is the sound of the world breathing out. There is something particular about the sea at night. In the daytime it is many things: a workplace, a highway, a boundary, a view. But at night it becomes something else, something older and less governable. The light goes down and the sound remains, and the sound, the slow pull and release, the push and hiss across the stones, has been there longer than anything we have built or named or understood. It was there before the first person stood on this shore and looked out and wondered what it was in the water. Tonight, we are going to sit beside that water, and we are going to explore one of the oldest traditions in all of Scottish folklore, the belief in a creature that lived in those dark depths, part woman, part salmon, known from the western islands to the Highland rivers, from the sea lochs of Sutherland to the sheltered firths of the east coast, known and respected and carefully avoided, and sometimes encountered. Tonight we are talking about the kiosk, the maid of the waves. The sea off the coast of Scotland is not a gentle thing, even in summer, even on the calmest days. There is a quality to the water up here that you do not find further south, a depth of colour that is almost black in places, a coldness just below the surface that does not leave, and a sense difficult to put into words, but felt by anyone who has spent time on this coast, that the water is occupied, that things move in it that do not make themselves visible. The kiosk is Scotland's own mermaid, and she is different in important ways from the golden-haired, coral-dwelling mermaids of southern legend. She is not a creature of the warm blue Mediterranean. She belongs to this water, grey water, cold light, the particular silver of a Highland river in spate. She has the upper body of a woman, pale and beautiful, and where her legs should be, the long, streamlined tail of a grilse, a young salmon, silver green and strong, built for exactly this kind of environment. That detail matters more than it might seem. In Scottish tradition, The salmon was never simply a fish. It was a creature of wisdom, of transformation, of the movement between worlds. The salmon knows both the sea and the deep interior of the land. It is born in the freshwater rivers of the Highland hills, swims out to the open ocean, and returns years later to the exact spot where it began, navigating thousands of miles by some knowledge that science has still not fully explained. The kiosk shares this quality. She is not only a creature of the sea, she follows the salmon routes. She is found in the sea lochs, but she is also in the rivers, the Conan, the Bewley, the dark narrow waters that cut up into the hills, and in the deep cold lochs far inland where the light barely reaches the bottom. In Scottish Gaelic, she is called the maighdean na tuinne, the maid of the waves, or the maighdean vara, the maid of the sea. Both names have been in use for a very long time, in communities where Gaelic was the daily language of fishing and farming and the long winter evenings. She was not an exotic or distant figure to the people of the Highland coast. She was a fact of the water, the way weather is a fact of the sky, something you did not control, something you worked around, something that could, if you were very unlucky or very bold or both at once, be encountered. The folklorist Donald Mackenzie, writing in the early 20th century, went further than most in thinking about what the kiosk might originally have been. He suggested that she was older than the folklore about her, that she began as a goddess, a deity of the water, to whom the earliest people of this coast made offerings, in the way that people have always made offerings to things that frighten them and sustained them in equal measure. Over centuries, he proposed, the goddess became a spirit, and the spirit became a creature of legend, and the legend settled into the fireside tradition we have now. Whether that is exactly right is impossible to say, but there is a weight to these traditions that feels older than any story. She does not feel invented. She feels like something people were trying to describe because they had genuinely encountered it and they needed a name for what they found. The old warnings about her were practical and consistent. Do not look into her eyes, or you will fall under a spell you cannot easily break. Do not stop walking when you hear singing from the rocks at dusk, because once you have stopped, the will to continue walking becomes very hard to find. If a kiosk is following your boat, and they were known to follow boats, drawn by curiosity or something else, throw empty barrels overboard. She cannot resist investigating a novelty, and the time she spends examining the barrels is the time you need to reach the shore. These are not the warnings of people who thought the creature was purely imaginary. These are the warnings of people who thought the creature was real and were passing on what they knew to keep their children safe. There was one circumstance in the old tradition in which the danger of the kiosk became something else entirely. If you could catch one in a net on a line, or with your bare hands in the shallows of a river, she would grant you 3 wishes in exchange for her release. Think about what that means in the context of the lives these people were living. Fishermen on the western coast of Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries worked some of the most unforgiving waters in the world. The sea could provide abundantly and kill without warning, sometimes on the same day. Illness, poverty, bad harvests, the loss of a boat and a livelihood, and the people on it. These were not remote possibilities. They were regular occurrences. And into this world comes the tradition that the creature in the water can grant wishes. 3 of them, whatever you choose. What people actually asked for when the stories record it is illuminating. There's a tale from Skye of a fisherman who one grey morning found a kiosk in his net. He kept his head. He held the net firm in the shallow water near the rocks, and he waited while she struggled, and he kept waiting until she stopped struggling and looked at him. And then he told her what he wanted. He wanted the gift of prophecy, the ability to see what was coming before it arrived. He wanted the power to cure the king's evil, a wasting illness of the glands, for which medicine had no reliable treatment, which swept through communities and left families helpless. And he wanted the art of music, not wealth, not long life, not safety from storms or an end to hard winters. What this fisherman asked for was the ability to see, the ability to heal, and the ability to make something beautiful. Prophecy, medicine, music. It tells you something about the people who told this story, what they thought was most worth having, what they would have asked for if the chance had come. Not things to make you rich, things to make you useful, things to make the world and the people around you a little less dark. The kiosk looked at him for a long moment. Then she granted all 3 and slipped back into the water so quickly that afterwards he stood there wondering if any of it had been real, whether the net had simply caught on a rock and the cold had made him strange. But then he felt it, the knowledge settling into him, the music beginning, somewhere behind his ribs. He became, by all accounts, a remarkable man. His prophecies were sought from miles away. The sick came to him, and he knew what to do. He played at every gathering in the district until the end of his life. He never spoke of how he had come to these gifts, but his family knew, and their children knew, and the story found its way down through generations, the way water finds its way through stone, slowly, quietly, leaving its mark. Not every 3-wish story ended so well. The old tradition was clear that the kiosk, while bound to honour a bargain, was also bound to honour it in the way she chose. She was an interpreter of human desire, and human desire is rarely as simple as it seems when you first state it. The stories warn that wishes could go sideways. that what you asked for and what you received could be the same thing and yet feel nothing like what you intended. There was wisdom in being careful. There was wisdom in thinking before you spoke about exactly what it was you truly wanted. There was another way the kiosk entered human life, and it was more enduring and more complicated than the granting of wishes. She married. In the tradition recorded along the Highland coast and in the islands, the kiosk was capable of shedding her salmon form entirely and walking on land as a woman. The mechanism varied between accounts. Sometimes she simply came ashore on certain nights. Sometimes the skin could be removed like a garment and hidden, after which she was unable to return to the sea. But the essential fact was consistent. She could choose to live among people, and sometimes she did. If this sounds familiar, it should. The Selkies, those seal folk of Orkney and Shetland, share the same pattern of the shape-shifting water woman who comes ashore, stays a while, and cannot quite belong. Both traditions belong to a much older story, common across the whole of northern Scotland and far beyond it. The kiosk and the selkie are different creatures, different in form and in the particular shape of their lore, but they are cousins of a kind, each one a version of the same deep human understanding that the sea contains presences who are almost like us, but not quite, who can love us, but cannot finally stay. The marriages that resulted were not simple things. They produced children, sometimes many children. They could last for years, even decades, and they were marked, in every account, by a particular quality in the woman herself, a quality that the people around her noticed and found difficult to name. She was present, but not entirely. She did her part in the household with skill and willingness, but there was always something that could not be reached, a faraway look when she stood at the water's edge, a stillness that came over her in the evenings when the light was going off the sea. The most complete mermaid marriage story that Scotland has produced comes from Orkney, and it concerns a man called Johnny Croy of Sanday. Sanday is the flat, sea-surrounded island at the northern tip of the Orkney archipelago, where the horizon feels very close and the wind almost never stops. It is the kind of place where you understand, at a level below thought, that the sea is not a backdrop, but the defining fact of existence. Johnny Croy of Folklore was, by all accounts, the bravest, boldest, and bonniest man in all the broken islands of Orkney. One day, he was out on the west shore of Sanday, threading his way through the boulders, looking for driftwood, when he heard a voice singing from the other side of a point of rock. Not a voice he recognised, not a tune he had heard before, something that stopped him in his tracks and pulled at him the way a strong current pulls. He crept around the crag and looked. On a weed-covered rock, with the tide just out and the sea lying pale and still around her, sat a mermaid, She belonged to the Finn folk tradition of Orkney, those shape-shifting sea people of the northern islands, whose traditions are even older than the Norse settlers, who gave the islands many of their names. Her hair was the colour of new gold, and it fell over her white shoulders like light moving on water. Her lower half was folded behind her on the rock, silver green in the afternoon, the tail of it curling slowly as she sang. In one hand she held a golden comb. She heard him, she rose to dive, and in her haste the comb fell from her hand and landed on the wet sand between them. Johnie reached it first. What followed was a negotiation conducted across the tide line. Two people, each wanting what the other had, and neither willing to yield entirely. She told him she could not bear the black rain or the white snow or the yellow sun. She wanted him to come with her to her crystal palace under the sea, where the wind never blows and the rain never falls. He said it was for the woman to follow the man. She disagreed. They stood there, she in the water and he on the sand, each tempting the other with a different world, each falling a little more in love in the arguing. Eventually they struck a bargain. She would live with him on the land for 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, he would go with her to visit her people beneath the sea. Her name, in her own tongue, was de Lovely, and the whole of Sanday came to see them married. She shivered and shook when they came to the church, and stuffed her long gold hair into her ears while the priest prayed. But no one who saw her could think of anything but how beautiful she was. She was a remarkable wife, the best bred on the island, the strongest ale. The sheep thrived, the cattle were fat, the barns were always full. For 7 years, everything at Volyar went as merry as a Yule fire from 1 year to the next. They had 7 children, each one as strong and well-made as their parents. But as the 7th year drew to its close, de Lovely wore a look that Johnie had not seen since the first months on land. A faraway look, a look of listening to something no one else could hear. The sea was calling, and she could hear it. On the last night, a boat appeared on the water that no one had seen before. Johnnie's mother, the local spaewife, a woman who knew things, understood what it meant. She bent a piece of wire into the shape of a cross, heated it in the fire until it glowed, and pressed it to the skin of the youngest child, who was still sleeping in her house. When de Lovely came to lift the baby's cradle, it would not move. She tried again. She flung back the blanket and reached for the child, and the moment she touched the cross mark, her skin burned, and she cried out and ran to the water's edge, weeping. With tears streaming and the whole of Orkney watching in silence, she called out in a voice that carried over the water, "Alas, alas, my bonny boy, alas, that I must leave one to live and die on dry land." The wind blew, the sail filled, Johnny Croy and his mermaid wife and their 6 eldest children turned west and were never seen again in Orkney. The old woman raised the baby she had saved. She called him Corsa Croy, Croy of the Cross. He grew up the bravest and bonniest man in the islands, which was entirely to be expected. He went on crusade. He married a great jarl's daughter. He became rich and famous, because the descendants of the sea folk, as the old people of Orkney knew, are always handsome and always lucky. That last detail, the luck, the sea knowledge, the uncanny skill passing down through generations, brings us to one of the most quietly remarkable traditions in all of the kiosk lore. Along the Highland coast and in the islands and in the communities built around the firths and the sea lochs, there were certain families whose men were known as exceptional maritime pilots. Pilots in the old sense, not aircraft, but boats. Men who could navigate the most dangerous coastal waters with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural, who knew where the hidden rocks were without being told, who could read a current or a tidal change in a way that other equally experienced men simply could not match, whose boats came home in weather that sank other boats. The explanation in the old understanding was simple. Somewhere in that family's past, there had been a marriage. A kiosk had come ashore for whatever reason and had stayed long enough to have children, and those children and their children after them had inherited something that was not quite human knowledge, something of the sea's own understanding of itself. The salmon instinct, perhaps, that deep, inexplicable orientation toward the water and its moods. Some families in the region even named a specific ancestor, a man called Paterson at Ceasg Ferry near the Black Isle, who was said to have fathered children by a kiosk, and whose family was promised that no one of his bloodline would ever drown at the crossing. Whether or not any particular family could genuinely trace their skill at sea to a mermaid ancestor is of course impossible to verify, but the tradition was taken seriously. It explained something that needed explaining. How some families seem to carry an understanding of the sea that went beyond experience or training, that appeared to be in the blood, passed from parent to child, in the way that eye colour is passed, or a particular quality of voice. The kiosk had given something to her children that she could not take back when she left, and she had not tried to take it back. She had let it remain with them and watched over it and continued to protect them in the water long after she had disappeared beneath its surface. There is something in this tradition that feels true in a way that goes beyond the literal. The idea that love persists past presence, that what you give to the people you care for does not end when you leave them, that something of you remains in them, guiding them through the difficult passages, even when you are nowhere to be seen. Not every encounter with the kiosk ended in wishes granted or marriages made. The tradition has another face, and it would be dishonest to sit by this water tonight and not acknowledge it. The same quality that made the kiosk compelling, her beauty, her voice, the strange pull she exerted on those who came close to her, also made her dangerous. She lured, not always with malice, perhaps, but with a power she carried, the way the sea carries its currents, present whether she meant it or not, and capable of taking people somewhere they had not intended to go. The old Highland tradition recorded a mermaid at a place called Port Henderson on the west coast. A man named Roderick Mackenzie, who came upon one resting on the rocks and managed to seize her by the hair before she could escape. She promised him in her alarm that if he released her, no boat he ever built would sink or drown its crew. He let her go, and the promise was kept throughout his long career as a boat builder. But the accounts note that he had come upon her unaware, and that the bargain was made under duress. There is an edge to many of these stories, the sense that the kiosk honoured her bargains but did not give her gifts freely, that what was taken from her was given without warmth. On the Black Isle, where the rivers run down from the hills to the Cromarty Firth, there is a recorded tradition of a man who found a kiosk resting at the river's edge on a summer's evening, and was bold or foolish enough to reach out and pull a handful of scales from her tail. Without her scales, she could not return to her proper form, and so she stayed, not willingly, but because she had no choice. She kept his house and knew things about the weather that made his fishing the envy of every other man on the firth, but she was never fully present. She stood at the river's edge in the evenings and looked at the water with a longing that had no words in any language he knew. In the end, it was one of their children who found the scales, where he had hidden them and brought them to her without understanding quite why, only that the object seemed to belong to her in a way that nothing else did. She held them for a long moment, looked at the child for a long time, and then kissed her very gently on the forehead. She walked to the river without running, and she was gone beneath the surface before the sound of the splash had finished. He came down to the river that evening and stood there for a long time, but in the years that followed, his fishing never failed. The storms turned away from his boat. Whatever had been taken from her, she had not withheld what she could give. The kiosk was also, in some traditions, a healer. There is a story from Galloway, in the southwest of Scotland, of a healer who had been unable to help a young woman who was dying. He sat on the shore in his despair, going over in his mind everything he had tried and found wanting, and a mermaid surfaced in the water nearby and sang to him, a song that was not music so much as information. She sang that he would let the bonny May die in his hand and the mugwort flowering in the land. He went and gathered the mugwort flowers and made a tincture from them and gave it to the girl, and she recovered. The mermaid was gone when he returned to the shore to give his thanks, the water smooth and empty in the evening light. This is the kiosk at her most generous and her most enigmatic, asking nothing in return, appearing and disappearing like the tide itself, on no timetable that anyone could predict or understand. There is a particular kind of seriousness that attaches to the recorded sightings of the kiosk, because many of them come not from folklore collections, but from named, credible witnesses who gave their accounts to people who wrote them down. Alexander Carmichael, the great collector of Gaelic tradition, whose work Carmina Gadelica remains one of the most important records of Highland culture we have, gathered several mermaid accounts in the late 19th century from people who said, plainly and without elaboration, that they had seen the maighdean with their own eyes. A crofter from Barra named Colin Campbell reported seeing what he first took to be an otter on a reef, raised his gun, and then saw through his telescope that the creature was a woman holding a child. Neil McEachen, a crofter from South Uist, described by Carmichael as a truthful man of exceptional memory, was sailing home on a calm summer afternoon when a creature appeared alongside his boat, from the waist up, resembling a woman, though with coarser hair and more glassy eyes, which gazed at his crew for a minute or more before slipping beneath the surface. One of his crew said he had seen something similar years before while cutting seaweed at Boisdale. These are not sensational accounts. They are the accounts of men who saw something they did not expect and tried to describe it accurately. Carmichael treated them as he treated all his material, carefully, without ridicule, and with the understanding that what the people of the islands believed about their world was worth preserving, regardless of whether the beliefs could be verified. The most documented encounter of all happened in 1830 on the island of Benbecula in the Outer Hebrides. A group of crofters were out on the reef at low tide, cutting seaweed. Slow, wet work, done at the tide's convenience rather than your own. One of the women had gone to the lower end of the reef to wash her feet in a still pool when she heard a splash and looked up. She called to the others. They came, and they all saw the same thing. A creature small as a child of 3 or 4, but formed like a woman, shoulders, hair, a face, turning and turning in the pool. When the men waded in to try to catch her, she moved beyond their reach with an ease that made their own movement through the water feel slow and clumsy. One of the boys on the shore picked up a stone and threw it. It struck her on the back. She cried out, a sound the accounts say that no one who heard it ever forgot. She disappeared beneath the surface. A few days later, on the beach at Galloway, about 2 miles away, she washed up, dead. People came from all across Benbecula and from the neighbouring islands to look at her. They stood around her in the pale island light and were unanimous. Her upper body, was the size of a well-fed child of 3 or 4 years of age, her skin white and soft, her hair long and dark and glossy. Her lower body was like a salmon's, but without scales. She was, they agreed, the maighdean Vara at last. The factor for Clanranald, Duncan Shaw, Baron Bailey and Sheriff of the district, was called. He came and he looked, and he ordered a proper coffin to be made, and a proper shroud, and the Mermaid of Benbecula was given a Christian burial, in the presence of a large crowd, a short distance above the shore where she had been found. The exact location of the grave is not known. The church records do not mention it. The dunes at Culla Bay have shifted over the years, and a large stone near the south end of the bay was examined in more recent times in the hope that it might mark the spot, but the examination was inconclusive. She is there somewhere, beneath the sand and the bent grass, with the sound of the sea above her. We know she existed because Alexander Carmichael heard about her 70 years after the event from people who said they had been there and touched her, and he wrote it down. He published it in the Carmina Gadelica in 1900, and that is how we have it. What she was in the rational sense remains an open question. A seal, some suggest, misidentified in the excitement. A dugong, though dugongs do not occur in Hebridean waters. Something else entirely. Something the sea keeps its own counsel about. But the coffin was real. The burial was real. The crowd that gathered was real. And the sound she made when the stone struck her, that sound which people remembered all their lives, that was real too. The islanders of Benbecula gave her back to the earth with the same care they would have given a person, because they understood, without needing to discuss it, that the sea deserves respect, and what the sea sends, you treat with care. There is a hillside on the western coast of Scotland where on a clear day you can stand and see the water in 3 directions at once. The sea loch below, the open Atlantic beyond the headland, the river mouth where the salmon come and go with the season. It is a kind of view that makes you understand why the people who lived here for generations built their entire imaginative world around water, not as a backdrop, not as scenery, as a defining fact of existence, the thing that provided and threatened and shaped and ultimately outlasted everything. The kiosk belongs to that world. She is what happens when people who live that close to the water try to understand what is in it, not in a scientific sense, not by measurement and taxonomy, but by imagination and experience and the slow accumulation of stories passed from one generation to the next. She is the water made human enough to talk to, made beautiful enough to love, made strange enough to keep you careful. She is the part of the world that will not be possessed. You can catch her, and she will grant you your wishes, and then she will be gone. You can marry her, and she will give you 7 children and the best bread on the island, and then she will go back to what she is. You can remove her scales, and she will stay. But the longing at the river's edge will be there every morning, and you will not be able to reach it, and eventually someone will return what you took. And yet, she is also the thing that watches over you after it is gone. She stays interested in her children. She guides the boats of her descendants through the rocks in the dark. She surfaces when a healer has given up and sings the answer into the evening air and asks nothing back. The kiosk is not only dangerous, she is also, in her own particular way, deeply faithful. Perhaps that is why the tradition of her has lasted so long, in so many different forms, across so much of Scotland's coastline and its rivers. She holds together things that are hard to hold together. The beauty and the danger, the love that cannot stay, and the protection that endures after it is gone. The gift given freely, and the gift that costs everything. She is the sea itself, given a face. Scotland's coasts and rivers are full of her still, in the particular quality of the water on a still morning, in the sound the tide makes as it shifts, in the families who feel, without being able to explain why, that the sea is something they understand at a level below thought. She has always been in this water, and she will be there long after the last story about her has been told. The fire is low now. The embers are settling into themselves, shifting gently. The last of the warmth they gathered, doing its quiet work. Outside the water is still, that particular stillness that comes in the small hours, when even the wind has laid itself down to rest, and the sea lies flat and dark and patient. We have spent the evening beside that water. We have met the kiosk in her many aspects. We have heard the lament of Jem de Lovely, carried across the Orkney Sound. We have followed the pilot families and the knowledge they carried in their blood. We have stood on the beach at Benbecula in 1830 and looked at what had come in from the sea. And we have sat with the healer on the shore in Galloway, listening to a song that arrived from the water and was gone before it could be thanked. What strikes me looking back across all of this is how consistent the kiosk is across the centuries and the regions. However the story changes, the setting, the characters, the particular encounter, something about her remains the same. She is always at the threshold. She is always in the place where one world meets another, and she is always, in some way, both a warning and a gift. The people who lived alongside her, who fished these waters and mended their nets in the evenings and told each other her stories, understood something that is easy to lose sight of in a world where so much of the natural world has been mapped and measured and explained. They understood that the sea is not simply a body of water. It is a presence, one that does not particularly care about us, but is capable of extraordinary generosity toward those who treat it with respect. The kiosk is that understanding, given a face and a name. Let yourself go now, gently into sleep. Let the sound of the water outside carry you. Let the darkness be restful rather than heavy. The maid of the waves is out there in the deep, cold water, following the salmon routes, doing whatever it is she does in the long hours before dawn. She is not looking for you tonight. Tonight she is simply there, the way the sea is there, patient and old, and full of a knowledge that has nothing to do with us, and does not need our understanding to be real. Sleep well by the water, and if these stories brought you somewhere tonight, if the water felt close and the old world felt real for a little while, consider leaving a like and finding your way back to the channel. There are more fireside journeys waiting here, more evenings by the water, more creatures and traditions and histories that deserve to be remembered. But for now, the fire is embers, the sea is quiet, and the maid of the waves is somewhere in the dark water below the keel. Good night from the fireside. Good night from Scotland. Good night